Milton wanted me to talk about ovary transplantation freezing for preserving fertility versus oocyte freezing, because it's an ongoing debate, and the majority of cancer patients are having oocyte freezing, which I think is probably a mistake for cancer patients. And there's a real legitimate question, even for healthy women, for social freezing: what's the best approach, oocyte freezing or ovary tissue freezing? So the outline of the talk is going to be first ovarian tissue cryopreservation and then oocyte cryopreservation, and I'll go into some of the techniques of it. And if I don't get through all my slides, you could write down my personal email right now, and I can send you these slides. It's drsherm, like Dr. Sherm, at AOL.com. Very, very simple, old email address. drsherm@aol.com, and I'd be happy to send you everything. And I think they're also going to be putting it on the website for the Ovarian Club. And then we'll just finally go into what's better in which patients, ovarian tissue versus oocyte freezing. So you saw this yesterday, but it's important to realize that everything begins in the epiblast. And John McCary kind of corrected me, but then I've got a little bit of a modification of this also from the MIT people and from Hayashi, that certainly germ cell specification begins right here in the epiblast, and they are germ cells, but they're not going to really be able to function well in either the testes or the ovary until they lose some of their pluripotentiality, which occurs as they travel up into the dorsal ridge. But it is correct, I've been told, to actually say these, in fact, are germ cells at this stage. And that's the origin of them, but they are expressing pluripotent genes, and they have to differentiate finally into PGCs, which they do before they enter the gonad. And that's the process, a simple diagram of how they go through this migration up to the dorsal ridge, and that's when they meet the gonad, whether testes or ovary. And I've talked a bit about this yesterday, but the issue is the intrinsic fertility of the human oocyte is totally age dependent. So you'd love to be able to freeze eggs in women who are in their 20s and not when they finally show up at your clinic at age 38 or age 40 wanting to do social freezing. And furthermore, the best prognosis cancer patients will be those that get Hodgkin's disease or leukemia or sarcomas at an early age, in their teen years or in their 20s or even prepubertally. That will be better prognosis than women who in their late 30s or early 40s get an ovarian cancer or breast cancer. And here's the graph, I'll remind you, that's extremely robust. And I think Simon misinterpreted this a little bit when Pasquale said we have a 25% pregnancy rate per egg in young women when there's been no ovarian stimulation, which is extraordinarily high. And he thought, well, we can improve that with IVF going to 50%. Well, we're not talking about for embryo transfer. We're talking about the pregnancy rate per oocyte is extremely high in young women. But by the age of 35, there is a 10% drop every year, a very serious drop. So when we're talking about success rates with whether it's ovary freezing or oocyte freezing, you have to look at the age at which the woman had either her ovary or her oocytes frozen. And this is an example, so you don't get confused, of our graph with no stimulation or very, very minimal stimulation. And I hope Norbert enjoys this graph. But you can, and Pasquale and I put this together, but then you can see lower what the pregnancy rate and live baby rate is with ovarian stimulation. And it's really 4 to 5 times lower per egg, not per embryo or per patient, but 4 to 5 times lower per egg. It's very, very robust data. I mean, this is not controversial. So again, you will probably, by freezing oocytes, you're not going to have a very high pregnancy rate per oocyte if you try to stimulate to get a huge number of eggs. But if you go with minimal stimulation, the pregnancy rate and live baby rate per oocyte will be extremely high. So here's just that summary. The live baby rate per oocyte with no stimulation or minimal is, for under 37, is 26%. But the index papers, and they keep showing it. It isn't just the paper, the original paper of Fabrizio that showed the limit and the paper by Cobo, but more papers are all showing with controlled ovarian hyperstimulation, you can expect about a 6 to 7% live baby rate per oocyte. And Anna Koba will put this together in a beautiful way with huge numbers. She's frozen more oocytes than anyone. And you need 40 frozen oocytes with conventional stimulation to have a 97% chance of having at least one baby. So a woman with cancer would really have to go through 2 or 3 or 4 cycles with heavy stimulation in order to really feel very secure. And I would maintain that as you can see on the right-hand side, if you freeze her young ovary tissue, you'll have 200,000 oocytes. So I think you're in a safer position. And this is just to show that taking out a whole ovary is not such a aggressive procedure. And you saw this yesterday, those of you who came for that talk, is that in this huge Japanese study with 24,000 women by Asui et al. In 2012, this is the curve you'd expect in almost any population with an average age of menopause at age 51. And then you superimpose upon that women who've had a unilateral oophorectomy, and you see hardly any difference. So as Klaus Anderson pointed out to me, was many years ago, the lower the ovarian reserve, by some process that's hard to understand, the lower the rate of primordial follicle recruitment. So it's very compensatory, and you can take out an ovary in a healthy woman without really worrying that you're doing her any harm. Now, our count, at least, has been that worldwide, looking at peer-reviewed live births, there have been 148 documented live births from frozen ovary tissue, and these were all in cancer patients. But the majority were case reports, so it's hard to really figure out what the success rate is. But based on tabulated series with young patients in Brussels, in Israel, in Denmark, and in our center, the live birth rates will vary between 41% and 76%. And so it's a very, very high success rate with ovary tissue freezing, and it may be an advantage over just doing one cycle of oocyte freezing where you might have maybe a 30 or 40% chance of pregnancy. Now, most of these were spontaneous pregnancies, not requiring IVF, and they were young women who had ovary cortex frozen prior to the treatment for cancer or other diseases. So that's really what we're advocating ovary freezing for. It may be good also for healthy women who just want to preserve fertility and don't want to go through 4 cycles of ovarian stimulation and oocyte freezing. It's a woman's decision to make. But all these patients, almost all, Klaus just mentioned it, have a return of ovarian function. I mean, they all work. And the question about pregnancy rate. Now, one of the points that Klaus has made to me many, many times is we can't really talk that much about pregnancy rate. Because if your group of patients did not have like radiation to the uterus or didn't have other problems, which many of these cancer patients have, then you'll have a higher pregnancy rate than if you're dealing with patients that have had radiation or other problems associated with them. So, as I said the other day, after the transplant, the AMH rises to very high levels as the FSH declines to normal or near normal. But nonetheless, with severely depleted ovarian reserve, these grafts remain functional and last for 5 years or longer. So the patients almost always have return of hormonal function 5 months post-transplant and fairly regular menstrual cycling. And this is the summarizing graph that Helen Skoletsky from MIT, she does all of our statistics, drew, just to put them all together where the AMH comes down, the FSH comes down and the AMH goes up. We interpret that to mean that it takes about 4 or 5 or 6 months for the primary follicle, once it's recruited, to reach the ovulatory or antral follicle stage, but also that very early on after the transplant, there was a massive over-recruitment of primordial follicles, which led 5 months later to this huge rise in AMH. And so if you're going to do IVF, the time to do IVF on these transplant patients is I'll show you again the graph, about 4 to 8 months after the transplant. When her AMH goes up, you will get a lot of eggs. But then if you try to do IVF later on, you'll be happy to get 1 or 2 eggs. Ovary tissue cryopreservation, I think at least for a young cancer patient, is a robust method. And the question is, how does it compare to oocyte cryopreservation for preserving a woman's fertility? Now, before vitrification was available, and this goes back to 1996, after I did studies with Roger Gosden, the only option for cancer patients for those 10 years, from 96 to 2006, was to freeze ovarian tissue, advocated by Gosden by his paper in 1994, and to use slow freezing for sure. Now, this was successful because oocytes in primordial follicles are small, about 30 microns compared to 140, and they're arrested in early meiosis with no metaphase spindle. So Gosden pointed out that freezing ovarian tissue could be very successful, and it certainly worked in his first studies in sheep. And for 40 years, it had actually been done in mice and in hamsters and experimental animals, and it worked even though we couldn't successfully freeze oocytes in human patients because we were retrieving mature oocytes that were 140 microns in diameter and had a very delicate metaphase spindle. So that was why we started out with ovary tissue banking, and we weren't even thinking about oocyte freezing in those early days. So the water content of a mature oocyte could only be reduced from 70% to 30% with the slow freezing. And that was the whole idea of slow freezing, was to get preferential crystallization outside of the cell because it was a lower osmotic pressure. And by slow freezing, you would gradually get more and more crystallization outside the cell, and that would draw more and more water out of the inside of the egg. And that would continue to happen until finally you reached a freezing point. You couldn't go below. So the smaller oocyte in the primordial follicle with no spindle could easily tolerate having this crystallization when there's still 30% water inside the cell, but the mature oocyte could not tolerate this. So then along comes vitrification, and I really want to give Masa Shigi, he doesn't get enough credit for this. Surely Roland Fahey was the first to report it in 1986, but it wasn't really practical or usable and reliable and totally robust until Masa Shigi really perfected it and really transported it around the world. And he was the first one, in fact, to do all of the oocyte freezing in Kobo's critical stellar first paper. So I want to make sure he gets credit. So after Masa, suddenly egg freezing became a routine. Larger mature metaphase oocytes could be safely frozen because you're not trying to really to get water out of the cell, and we're 70% water, all we're trying to do was just make it like glass and not have crystallization. So what about vitrification versus slow freeze? So vitrification avoids any ice crystal formation by using a very dense concentration of cryoprotectant and ultra-rapid speed of cooling. Slow freeze relies on partial and gradual removal of water from the cell by encouraging ice crystal formation, preferentially on the outside of the cell. The freezing point is higher outside the cell because of lower osmolality, thus drawing water out of the cell, reducing water from 70% to 30% as the cell cools. Now, I don't have time to really go into this, but probably most of you know the standard slow freeze protocol for embryos that was just, it's very simple and it's very nice and not adequate really for oocytes. Some would argue it is, but most of us think it wasn't. But before I go into the rest of the talk, which I may have to quit because of time, I want to make it clear that I agree totally with Klaus that for ovary tissue freezing, slow freeze works just great. And the only reason we use vitrification, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is because it seems to me to be a little bit easier, and many IVF labs don't even have slow freezing machines anymore. So at some point, there's going to have to be vitrification of ovarian tissue because you don't even have a freezing machine in your lab. But slow freeze works just fine for these resting eggs that are only 30 microns in diameter without a metaphase spindle. At any rate, we can go through this, and I can send you our protocols for everything. The flaw actually for slow freeze is very simple also. You just go down in gradual dilutions of osmotic cryoprotectant and a high solution of sucrose, because what you want to avoid is obviously hypoosmotic shock, where you thaw it and in physiologic solution, and the water pours into the cell and bursts the egg or the embryo. So you're avoiding it by gradually changing the osmotic potential. And this is just a diagram to give you an idea of what Masa's first approach. He's got a much better approach now that we use, but it's always the same concept. slow, gradual immersion in a very high-dense vitrification media, which we first call ES, or equilibration solution, and then slow, gradual immersion in a super high vitrification media, like 15% ethylene glycol and 15% DMSO. And none of these vitrification solutions, none of these cryoprotectants are toxic. Now, I know that's a strong statement, and there's going to be a lot of screaming out there. What is he talking about? They are not toxic. They have given an appearance of toxicity because of too rapid an osmotic shift. But they themselves are not toxic. Why is that important? That's very important because you want to see the egg shrink and then expand before you put it in liquid nitrogen. If you just go by timing alone, you could be wrong. In fact, older eggs often might take more than 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes to completely equilibrate. I know in the vitrification machines that Amir Arav has made, he's figured all that out. So he makes the point you don't have to look. But aside from that freezing machine, which is kind of guaranteed to give you a really gradual osmotic shift, which is the key to success with oocyte freezing, aside from that, if you're just doing it by hand, you must watch the embryo or the egg contract and then re-expand. And then the thawing is really, really simple, just to, again, to avoid hyperosmotic shock. So Cobo's live baby rate per oocyte was 6.5%, the same as Patrizio documented with fresh, and Naji showed the same good results. So there was no difference between frozen oocytes and fresh oocytes. And as I said, to have a 97% chance of having a baby, at least one baby, 40 oocytes were needed. It won't be that big a number if you use minimal stimulation. But for the usual ovarian hyperstimulation, that's the way it is. Now, let's look at the total. I said there's 148 documented babies from ovarian tissue freeze. Well, there's 3,881 documented babies from oocyte freeze. So clearly the experience with oocyte freezing is gigantic, and it's very safe. But virtually none of these are with cancer patients. So most of the ovary tissue freezing cases that are pregnancies and documented are with cancer, and the oocyte freezing cases either with a donor oocyte bank or for social reasons. That's an important difference to talk about, because freezing oocytes with 38-year-olds is not going to be the same as a donor oocyte bank or freezing oocytes for young women. And that's because the membrane permeability is much less. So particularly if you're going to freeze oocytes on 38 or 40-year-old women, you absolutely must watch the oocyte contract but then re-expand, because it's going to take a longer time to re-expand. At any rate, you can see that the live baby rate per oocyte, we looked at it from all of the reported documented cases, and it can vary from, say, 18% to, or 32% to 4.9% in women under 35 or under 40 years of age. And so I think because time is down, I maybe have only 5 minutes. I shouldn't go through these details of the vitrification for oocyte or embryo freezing, but I think I've got a really good simple protocol for those that aren't doing it yet, and if you email me, you'll have it all on these slides. This is the way we do it now. We're using I have no financial interest whatsoever in Masashiki's company, and I have no conflict of interest in anything really, but I do like this approach. It's a much simpler way of getting gradual osmotic shift, and that's, of course, that's the whole secret of doing oocyte freezing safely, is making sure osmotic changes are gradual. And this is a sort of diagram of how we do it, just by going from the top of the well to the bottom of the well gradually. With the vitrification solution, we retrieve the floating oocyte that floated to the surface and contracts and maintain it near the tip of the pipette and blow it again and again to the bottom and watch it contract and then float, and then it re-expands and sinks. And that's an important, it's observation, it's important. I've already said that the cryoprotectants are not toxic. You just have to be very careful about osmotic shifts. Originally, we used this bridge technique to get very gradual osmotic shifts, and that was after going from various osmotic gradients and Nunc wells, and now we just use a very, very simple procedure of allowing the oocyte to gradually sink over time in a solution. This is how this is just an embryo. It shows how before you put it in the VS solution, and then after 5 minutes and after 12 minutes, it shrinks. Oh, I don't have all of it there. So the disadvantage of oocyte freezing for cancer is cancer patients have little time to preserve their fertility. They certainly need more than one oocyte retrieval, and many will have already undergone initial chemotherapy and have no developing follicles to respond to ovary stimulation. Particularly leukemia patients will have already gone through initial chemotherapy, and if you're going to freeze their ovarian tissue, please freeze it after they're in remission after chemotherapy. Don't be in a rush to freeze it. Many primordial follicles will have survived this initial chemotherapy and can be preserved well with ovary freezing. In fact, that was the case with the very first report that Marrow did. This was a patient who was in menopause, actually, but had primordial follicles still intact after initial chemo, and that was his first pregnancy. So in general, we think ovary tissue freezing is the best approach for cancer patients, but what about costs? For healthy women just wanting to put off childbearing, oocyte freezing may at first seem easier, but we still would want to do at least 3 cycles to give them some measure of assurance, and in the United States, this could add up to easily to $45,000 or more. A simple ovary freeze would be less than $6,000 and just require one very simple outpatient procedure. Furthermore, transplanting back the tissue can give them hormonal function even after they might have otherwise been in menopause 20 years later. So we're finding many female business executives and physicians who are very sophisticated choose ovary freezing for this to preserve fertility rather than egg freezing. So each woman has to decide which method of preserving her fertility is most appropriate for her. Now, my time is up, so I'm not going to go into more of the details on ovary transplantation and oocyte freezing, but I just conclude by pointing out that, most of us that do both, and we do both, feel that ovary tissue freezing is ideal for the cancer patients, and most women who just want to preserve fertility for social reasons will prefer oocyte freezing, but some of them will just prefer to get their ovary out, freeze it, and be done with it, and not have to worry about it anymore. Thank you very much.